It was the morning of December 2, 1950, on the frozen shore of the Chosin Reservoir, and the column was already coming apart. Trucks sat burning near a low rise the maps called Hill 1221, black smoke bending flat in a wind that cut at 24 degrees below zero. Lieutenant Colonel Don Faith had died on this stretch of road the day before, and the men who had followed him were now leaderless. Officers were down. Radios had gone silent. Small groups peeled away from the wreckage and walked out onto the open ice of the reservoir itself, in plain sight because the ice was the only road left that did not run through Chinese guns. Nobody had planned for this. 9 weeks earlier, roughly 3,200 American soldiers and Korean augmentation troops known as Kalutuas had marched east of the reservoir as part of a task force nobody outside the army would remember by name. By the time the ice rescue parties stopped counting, barely 385 of those men were still fit to carry a rifle. Historians would later call the ratio one of the worst suffered by any American unit in the Korean War, worse, by some counts, than what the Marines endured on the reservoir's other shore, in a battle that made headlines for decades to come. This task force did not even have a name while it was fighting. The soldiers called it by their battalion numbers or simply the outfit east of the reservoir. It was an Army historian working through dusty after-action reports more than a decade later who gave it the name history remembers today, Task Force Faith. For years it had almost no reunions, no veterans association, no place in the story the country told itself about Chosin. To understand how 3,200 men ended up alone on that ice, the story has to start 9 weeks earlier, in Japan, when the war still looked like it was almost won. In August of 1950, at Camp Crawford on the northern Japanese island of Hokkaido, the Army pieced together a fighting unit that had, until then, existed mostly on paper. It was called the 31st Regimental Combat Team, RCT-31 for short, built around the 31st Infantry Regiment and reinforced with artillery, anti-aircraft guns, and engineers. Colonel Richard Ovenshine commanded it at first. Many of its soldiers were fresh out of occupation duty, garrison troops who had spent years polishing boots in peacetime Japan rather than training for a shooting war, and within weeks they would be tested against a country most of them could not have found on a map. The regiment came ashore on November 3, 1950, at the port of Iwon on Korea's northeast coast, part of an operation the Army called Tailboard. The mood on the beach was almost cheerful. United Nations forces had pushed north through the fall, Seoul was recaptured, and officers up and down the line spoke openly of driving to the Yalu River, the border with Manchuria, and having the whole army home by Christmas. Trucks and jeeps churned inland through hills already dusted with early snow, and the men of RCT-31 rode north believing they were mopping up the last of a beaten enemy. Colonel Alan McLean led the combined force east of the Chosin Reservoir, a soldier built for paperwork as much as combat, gray already showing at his temples in his mid-40s. He carried binoculars around his neck and a leather map case over one shoulder, and he ran his command by the book, careful with supply lines, careful with reports up the chain. Officers who served under him called him thorough rather than bold. It was a habit of mind that had kept men alive in easier campaigns. Nobody yet knew whether it would be enough against an enemy that had not yet shown itself. Lieutenant Colonel Don Faith commanded the 1st Battalion, 32nd Infantry, and at 32 he was younger than most men holding a battalion, lean and weathered under his fur-hooded parka, with a temper that ran hot only when his men were shorted on ammunition or rations. He had jumped into Normandy and fought through the Pacific, and the soldiers under him trusted him the way men trust an officer who eats last and checks the perimeter himself at midnight. He wore no decorations yet on his field jacket. That would change in 3 weeks, in a way he would not welcome. Attached to the task force was Captain Edward Stamford, a Marine assigned as a tactical air controller, an unusual arrangement that would matter more than anyone guessed. Stamford carried a portable radio handset strapped across his chest, the only reliable link between the men on the ground and the Marine Corsairs and Navy fighters flying overhead. He had grease-streaked leather gloves and a pair of binoculars for spotting targets through smoke and snow. In the weeks ahead, that radio would be the difference between a unit that survived a night and one that did not. Nearly 700 of the men marching north were not American at all, but Korean soldiers folded into the ranks under a program called Kalatsa, Korean augmentation to the United States Army. Most had been civilians weeks earlier, handed rifles and boots that did not always fit, placed into squads where few of the Americans spoke their language. One young Kalusa soldier, unnamed in the surviving records, carried a single C-ration tin against his body for days, thawing it with his own warmth rather than risk breaking a tooth on frozen stew. He would carry that tin for a long time yet, through worse cold than this. On November 15, an advance element reached the smaller Chosin Reservoir to the east and traded fire with roughly 200 Chinese troops, a brief, almost forgettable skirmish that should have told the command something. Prisoners taken in the encounter spoke of entire Chinese divisions moving south, dug in along the ridgelines, waiting. The reports went up the chain and largely stayed there. Intelligence officers at higher headquarters were confident the Chinese would not commit large forces this late in the year, and confidence in November of 1950 was cheaper than caution. By November 23, the temperature east of the reservoir had dropped to 2 degrees below zero, and the cold was already doing damage no enemy had inflicted yet. 83 men were treated for frostbite that week, 33 of them evacuated, fingers and toes gone white and numb inside boots that were never rated for weather like this. Rifle bolts froze solid, machine gun oil turned to paste. It was a warning written on the bodies of the men themselves, and like most warnings that arrive quietly, it changed almost nothing about the orders coming down from above. By November 27, the task force was strung out along roughly 10 miles of narrow road on the reservoir's east side, spread thin between the villages the maps called Sinhungni, Pungnurigang, and Hudongni. Colonel McLean had the 3rd Battalion, 31st Infantry, Faith's 1st Battalion, 32nd Infantry, batteries of the 57th Field Artillery, and a platoon of anti-aircraft guns strong enough to level a hillside, but nothing built for close infantry fighting. On the ridges above them, though none of them could see it yet, 2 full Chinese divisions, some 15,000 to 20,000 men, were already moving into position. The next afternoon, November 28, Major General Edward Almond flew in by helicopter to visit the perimeter, an aide named Lieutenant Alexander Haig at his side. Almond waved off reports of a major Chinese buildup, telling the exhausted men facing him that the enemy delaying them was nothing more than the remnants of Chinese divisions fleeing north, by most accounts calling them, dismissively, a bunch of Chinese laundrymen. Then he pinned a silver star on Lieutenant Colonel Faith's chest for an action days earlier, climbed back into his helicopter and left. Faith stood holding the ribbon like it weighed more than it should have. The men of RCT 31 did not know yet how alone they were. Their line ran along the reservoir's eastern shore, a chain of foxholes and log bunkers strung between Sinhungni, Pungnurigang, and Hudongni, built for a full division and held by barely a regiment. 6 miles of frozen water separated them from the Marines dug in on the west side, close on a map, unreachable on the ground. Faith still had the Silver Star ribbon in his pocket. He hadn't pinned it on. He'd folded it once, hard, and put it away like something that embarrassed him more than it honored him. Colonel McLean walked the line that afternoon with his map case open against his chest, checking positions against the terrain the way a man checks a lock twice before bed. The 57th Field Artillery had its howitzers dug in behind the infantry, and a platoon of the 15th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion sat with guns that could shred an airplane but had never been built to stop a man crawling through snow. Patrols coming back that evening reported movement on the high ground, dark shapes against darker ridgelines, gone before anyone could be sure what they'd seen. Somewhere along the line, a Kalusa soldier nobody had bothered to learn the name of carried a C-ration tin against his chest, under 2 layers of wool, keeping it just warm enough to break with a spoon later. He wasn't hungry yet. He was cold, and holding something close to his body was its own kind of comfort. Around him, men widened their foxholes another few inches before the ground froze too hard to dig, breath clouding white, rifles laid across sandbagged lips, waiting on a night that felt, without anyone saying so, wrong. It is full dark now, past 9 o'clock, and the temperature is already well below zero. On the ridge above the 3rd Battalion sector, a bugle sounds, thin and far off, then another answers it from a different direction. A whistle cuts through the cold air. For a moment nobody moves, listening, hoping it is nothing. Then a flare goes up somewhere to the north, and by its light the sentries see what the darkness had been hiding. Hundreds of men in quilted uniforms, moving down the slope at a dead run. The Chinese 80th and 81st Divisions came off those ridges in numbers no American on that perimeter had been told to expect. 15 to 20,000 men against a task force barely a fifth that size. They hit the seams first, the gaps between companies where the line thinned to almost nothing, blowing bugles and whistles to mask their movement and to terrify men who had never heard the sound before. Machine guns opened up along the American positions, tracers stitching orange lines through the snow, and within minutes the quiet perimeter Faith and McLean had walked that afternoon was a battlefield. There would be no single moment when the men of RCT 31 understood the size of what had found them in the dark. It arrived in pieces, a foxhole overrun here, a machine gun position silenced there, radio traffic turning frantic company by company. Allman's words from that morning, laundrymen fleeing north, were still fresh enough to taste, and they were already wrong. This was not a delaying action by a broken enemy. It was 2 full divisions with a plan, and the clock the task force didn't know it was on had just started running. Along the 1st Battalion sector near Punggye-ri Inlet, Faith moved between positions in a half-crouch, checking ammunition counts, ordering artillerymen to depress their howitzer barrels and fire point blank into the attacking waves. The 57th Field Artillery's guns, built for indirect fire at distant targets, now fired over open sights at men close enough to see clearly by muzzle flash. A machine gun crew held a bend in the line for 20 minutes before Chinese soldiers came over the parapet from 3 sides at once, and the position went silent. The cold had turned into its own enemy inside the fight. Carbines jammed as lubricating oil thickened to paste in the barrel in action, and more than one soldier, desperate and out of options, urinated on a frozen bolt to work it free enough to fire again. Hands numbed past feeling fumbled grenade pins. A man might find his weapon useless at the exact second he needed it most, forced to fight with a bayonet, a trench knife, or his fists, while 30 yards away another soldier's rifle worked fine, simply because he'd kept it wrapped and warm an hour longer. Overhead, when the weather allowed it, Marine Corsairs came in low over the ridgelines, called down by Captain Edward Stamford, the task force's attached air controller, working his radio handset against the static and the cold with a steadiness men later remembered clearly. His voice, calm through the crackle, walked pilots onto targets close enough to the perimeter that the concussion of their rockets and napalm rattled American foxholes too. It was the one advantage the task force held that the enemy did not, and every man on that line knew what it meant when, for stretches, sky went quiet. By the gray hour before dawn on November 28th, the first assault had broken, but at a cost the task force was only beginning to measure. Aid stations built for a company's worth of wounded were holding 3 times that many, medics working by flashlight with morphine syrettes, thawed against their own skin before they could be used. Trucks meant for supply runs were pressed into service as ambulances, wounded stacked 2 deep under whatever canvas could be found. The perimeter had held through the night. It had not held cheap. Through that second day, McLean and Faith worked to pull the line tighter, consolidating positions, shortening the perimeter to something fewer men could actually defend. Patrols went out and came back with the same report. The enemy was still there, dug into the high ground, not retreating, not laundrymen, not remnants of anything. Wire was strung where there hadn't been time for it the day before. Artillery batteries adjusted their registration points. Every man understood, without needing to be told twice, that the fight from the previous night was not finished. It was intermission. Night fell again on November 28th, and with it came cold that made the previous evening feel mild by comparison. 30 then 35 degrees below zero, air so cold it burned going into the lungs. The Chinese attacked again after dark, in the same pattern of bugles and whistles and human waves, but heavier this time, throwing fresh troops against a perimeter that had already spent most of what it had the night before. Along the Kalatsa soldiers' section of the line, the frozen sea ration tin was still tucked against his chest. He still hadn't eaten it. He didn't have time. The fighting that second night came in close, sometimes hand to hand, as Chinese soldiers broke through gaps and American troops fought to seal them again with whatever was at hand: rifle butts, entrenching tools, bayonets fixed in the dark. Positions changed hands more than once in places, taken, lost, retaken by counterattacks organized on the spot by sergeants and lieutenants because there wasn't time to wait on orders from further back. Somewhere in that chaos, along the ice at the reservoir's edge, figures were moving that Colonel McLean would soon mistake for his own men. McLean had been told a column of his own troops was withdrawing across the frozen inlet, and when he saw men moving on the ice in the half-light before dawn, he believed it. He ran toward them, calling out, waving them in, certain he was bringing lost soldiers back to friendly lines. By most accounts, no one close enough to stop him understood what he was seeing until it was already too late to matter. The men on the ice were Chinese infantry, and McLean was running straight toward them across open ground with nothing between them but distance closing fast. It happens in seconds. McLean is 30 yards out, 40, still calling, still certain, when the rifle fire starts. He goes down hard on the ice, hit more than once, and does not get back up on his own. Chinese soldiers reach him before any American can, and he is dragged away across the frozen reservoir, wounded and taken prisoner, out of reach of the men who had followed his orders for 3 months across Korea. He would die in captivity days later, though none of the soldiers watching from the shore that morning would learn that for a long time. Word moved down the line the way bad news does in combat, fast and half-formed, before anyone had the full shape of it. McLean was gone, captured or worse, and command of the scattered battalions on the reservoir's east side passed to Lieutenant Colonel Faith, 32 years old, holding a Silver Star ribbon he still hadn't on. He hadn't asked for this. There was no ceremony, no order read aloud, just a radio call and a map case handed off, and a task force that history would not even name after him for another 15 years. On November 30, word came down from higher command that the tanks and infantry holding Hudong-ni, roughly 4 miles south along the only road out, would pull back to Hagaruri to help defend the marine perimeter there. The decision made a certain sense on a map drawn far from the fighting. On the ground, it meant Faith's task force, already isolated on the reservoir's east shore, was losing the one friendly position close enough to reach them if things went wrong. The road south was still open. It would not stay that way. By the time the sun set on November 30, Faith's perimeter stood alone in a way it had not been alone the day before, cut off from Hudong-ni, cut off from the Marines across the ice, cut off from any relief that could arrive in time to matter. Stamford's radio still crackled with air support overhead when the weather allowed it, the one thread still holding. Around him, roughly 3,000 men, American and Korean both, dug into ground they now understood they might not leave the way they'd come. The noose that had been loose on November 27 was closing fast. Faith spent the last hours of November 30 doing what commanders do when the map has run out of good options. He pulled his scattered companies inward, off the exposed ridgelines his men had held for 3 days, and drew one tighter perimeter around the schoolhouse and the frozen inlet at Pungyuri. It was not a retreat, not yet. It was concentration, the oldest answer to being badly outnumbered, and it meant giving up ground soldiers had bled for without firing a shot in the giving of it. By full dark, the consolidation was done. Truck engines idled to keep from freezing solid, exhaust hanging low over packed snow. The wounded were moved into the schoolhouse and stacked trucks at the center of the perimeter, the closest thing to shelter the position had. Outside the ring, riflemen scraped shallow positions into ground too frozen for a full foxhole, using entrenching tools and, when those failed, bayonets. Faith walked the line once before midnight, saying little, checking each machine gun crew himself. Somewhere in that walk, men later said, Faith stopped near a burned-out truck and reached up to his parka. He unpinned the Silver Star ribbon Almond had fixed to his chest 2 days before, for an action that had not yet been fought, and tore it loose. He did not say anything the men remembered as dramatic. He dropped the ribbon in the snow and kept walking. It was over in a few seconds, but the soldiers who saw it never forgot it, and some later said it was the moment they understood exactly how bad things had gotten. What Faith could not know with certainty that night was the size of what waited beyond the tree line. Corps intelligence had described fleeing remnants, a broken enemy in retreat. The truth, pieced together later from prisoners and captured orders, was 2 full Chinese divisions, the 80th and 81st, upward of 15,000 men, closing around a perimeter holding perhaps 3,000. No reinforcement was forming at Hagaruri, no relief column was on the road. Whatever came next, the task force would meet it alone. Faith gathered his officers by lantern light inside the schoolhouse and laid out what little he could promise. Hold through the night, pool the ammunition, save the last of the fuel for the trucks. Beyond that, no one pretended to know more. Outside, the thermometer was already sliding past 30 below, and somewhere past the tree line the first bugles of the evening sounded, thin and far off, the kind of sound a tired man could almost convince himself he had imagined. He had not. The cold arrived before the Chinese did. By 9 o'clock the temperature stood at 30 below, close to 35 with the wind coming off the reservoir and metal burned bare skin on contact. Then the mortar rounds started walking in from the ridgeline south of the perimeter, and behind them came the bugles again, closer this time, answered by whistles from 3 directions at once. Faith's runners moved company to company in a crouch, passing the same short order. Hold what you've got, don't waste rounds on shadows. Campfires that had burned freely 2 nights earlier were banked low now, or put out entirely, kicked apart and buried in snow, the moment an officer spotted the glow. A fire meant a silhouette, and a silhouette meant a target for men who could see in the dark better than most Americans wanted to admit. So the perimeter went dark by choice. Men pressed shoulder to shoulder in shallow scrapes, breath fogging white above them, watching a tree line they could barely see and listening for footsteps in snow that carried sound for 100 yards. The cold did something to hands that no amount of will could undo. Fingers curled stiff inside frozen gloves, lost the fine motor control a trigger required, and more than one man discovered, in the middle of an assault, that he could see a target and could not make his hand close around the pull. Some fired with 2 fingers locked together, some pulled a trigger with a knuckle instead. Medics moving the line that night saw fingers black at the tips on soldiers who had not even noticed, too busy holding a rifle to feel what the cold had already taken. Weapons failed as often as men did. Bolts froze solid in the sub-zero air, actions that had cycled fine an hour earlier locked tight with condensation turned to ice. Soldiers learned fast, the way soldiers learn things that keep them alive, that urinating on a frozen bolt could thaw it enough to work again. And along the perimeter that night men did exactly that, crouched over their own rifles in the dark, unashamed, because a jammed weapon in front of an assault was a death sentence, and there was no time for anything else. Ammunition became its own kind of clock. Squad leaders crawled the line counting rounds by feel in the dark, redistributing a full bandolier here, 3 grenades there, robbing a machine gun crew that had less to feed one that had none. Nobody said the word rationing out loud, but everyone understood it. A private could tell exactly how many magazines were left in his pouch without looking, and every man on that perimeter had already started doing the arithmetic of how long what he was carrying would actually last him. An unnamed Kalusa soldier, one of roughly 700 Korean troops folded into the American ranks, carried a single C ration tin through the fighting that night, thawed against his chest under his coat since the last resupply. He never opened it. Twice he offered it to the American private beside him, who twice waved it off, and each time the tin went back inside the coat, kept for later for worse, for whenever worse arrived. It was a small thing, one frozen can passed back and forth in the dark, but it was the kind of thing men remembered afterward better than the fighting itself. Somewhere past midnight, that same private and the Kalatsa soldier traded watch without a word between them, one settling into the scrape as the other eased out to stretch cramped legs for 5 minutes before the cold made him move again. Neither spoke much English the other understood well, and neither needed to. A tap on the shoulder, a nod toward the tree line, a hand closing around a rifle stock, that was the whole conversation, repeated every hour or so along a perimeter full of men who had stopped needing full sentences to work together. Captain Stamford kept his radio handset against his ear through most of the night, the one line still connecting the perimeter to anything beyond it. When the Chinese pressed close enough that the front line and the enemy line blurred into the same patch of dark, Stamford called strikes in tighter than doctrine liked, walking napalm and rockets to within yards of American foxholes because yards were the margin that mattered. Overhead, when the weather allowed it, aircraft answered, and for a while the glow of a strike lit the snow orange before the dark closed back over the perimeter. By 2 a.m, the schoolhouse holding the wounded was full past what anyone had planned for. Medics worked by flashlight cupped inside a coat to keep the beam from drawing fire, packing frost-bitten hands and shrapnel wounds with whatever dressing remained, running low on morphine well before they ran low on wounded. Men who could still walk were sent back out to the line within the hour because the line needed bodies more than the schoolhouse needed help it could not give. Nobody complained. There was nothing to say that would change it. Near 3, a section of the line thinned enough that Chinese soldiers reached the outer wire before anyone stopped them, and for a few minutes the fighting on that stretch turned close, rifle butts and bayonets in the dark as much as bullets. A sergeant whose name did not make it into any after-action report held the gap alone for close to a minute before reinforcements arrived at a dead run, and the line closed back over the breach the way water closes over a stone. It held. It would not hold indefinitely, and every man there knew it. Dawn came gray and slow, the kind of light that seemed to take an hour to decide whether it was actually morning. The perimeter that greeted it was smaller than the one that had gone dark the night before, pulled in tighter still around the schoolhouse and the trucks, marked now by bodies neither side had recovered and equipment abandoned where men had dropped it to run. Faith walked the shrunken line once more in the new light, counting faces instead of positions, doing arithmetic nobody wanted to say out loud. The Chinese pulled back with the sunrise, the way they had the morning before, leaving the perimeter standing but hollowed out from the inside. Faith's officers reported the numbers quietly, ammunition down by more than half, fuel enough for the trucks to move but not far, wounded now outnumbering the men still fit to carry a rifle. There was no relief column visible on the southern road and none was coming. Whatever the task force did next, it would have to do walking, and it would have to decide by nightfall. On the morning of December 1, Lieutenant Colonel Faith made the call nobody wanted to make and everybody had been half expecting. No relief column had come up the southern road, and none was coming. The task force would break out on its own, trucks and legs, straight down the road toward Hagaruri and the Marine lines waiting roughly 11 miles away. He gathered what officers were still standing and gave the order in plain words: load the wounded first. Destroy what could not be carried. Every man who could walk would walk, and every man who could still fire a rifle would cover the ones who could not. The trucks lined up along the frozen road, engines coughing in air that hovered somewhere near 30 below, and men loaded the wounded onto open beds packed so tight there was no room left to lie flat. Some of the injured had frostbitten hands too numb to grip a blanket. A Kalatsa soldier tucked a frozen sea ration tin inside his coat again, against his chest, the way he had for 2 days now, though he still had not managed to eat from it. Faith walked the column once, checking faces, before he climbed onto the lead vehicle and gave the signal to move out. The column rolled south a little after noon, 30-some vehicles, and what was left of a task force strung out along a road hemmed in by pine ridges on both sides. Chinese fire opened up within the first mile, rifle rounds cracking off the truck beds, and the column had to stop and fight its way past position after position instead of simply driving through. Every stall on the road cost minutes the wounded in the beds could not spare. Faith moved up and down the line on foot, directing fire, pulling stalled trucks forward by hand when the drivers went down. Overhead, Captain Stamford worked his radio without pause, calling coordinates to Marine Corsairs and Navy Tigercats stacked in the cold sky above the column. His handset had carried the task force through the worst of the last 2 nights, and now it was carrying something close to their only hope of reaching Hagaruri alive. Through the day he directed 38 sorties onto the ridgelines flanking the road, aircraft rolling in low, engines screaming, dropping napalm and firing rockets into Chinese positions that had the column pinned from higher ground. The numbers told their own story later: 21 napalm tanks, 16 500-pound bombs, 21 fragmentation bombs, and 190 rockets fired in support of one column trying to move 11 miles. Ridge after ridge went up in orange fire and black smoke, and for stretches of road the column could move at something close to a walking pace instead of crawling from cover to cover. It was, by any measure, as much air power as one battalion-sized group could reasonably ask for. It was still not quite enough. Late in the afternoon, one strike came in wrong. A napalm run meant for a Chinese position along the ridge dropped short, and fire fell across part of the column itself, catching men and vehicles that were supposed to be friendly. Survivors would remember the heat of it more than the sound, a wall of orange rolling over trucks already crowded with wounded who could not run from it. Faith kept the column moving through the smoke and the screaming, because stopping on that road, even for that, meant dying on it instead. Near the front of the column, a Chinese grenade landed close enough to knock Faith down and tear into his side and legs. He got back up. Men nearby, who saw it happen, said later that he waved off help, pressed a hand against the wound, and kept walking the line as if the only thing that mattered was the 200 yards of road still ahead of him. The column had a roadblock waiting near Hudong, one more obstacle between the wounded and the Marine lines, and Faith intended to be standing when they reached it. The roadblock at Hudong turned out to be manned in strength, log barriers and dug-in riflemen covering the only way through. Faith organized what was left of his able-bodied men into an assault line, firing his pistol and throwing grenades as he led them forward on foot, the same way he had led every other stretch of that day. It is close to dusk now, the light failing fast over the ridges, and the column behind him has stopped dead, waiting on whether the men in front can open the road one more time. About 30 yards from the roadblock, rifle fire caught Faith and put him down for good. By most accounts, he did not stop giving orders even then, directing the last of the assault with what strength he had left until the position broke and the road opened. Men carried him back to the column afterward and laid him in the back of a truck. He did not survive the ride. The Medal of Honor citation written for him later would say simply that he continued to direct the attack until the roadblock was overrun. Word of Faith's death moved through the column the way bad news moves in the cold, quietly man to man without anyone stopping to mark it. There was no time for that on that road, no formation to stand at attention in, no flag to fold. Command passed to whoever was senior and still standing, and the trucks kept moving because moving was the only thing left that made any sense. Somewhere behind them in the snow lay a silver star ribbon a general had pinned on his chest 3 days earlier, torn off and thrown away. The column pushed on into the dark, past Hudong and toward a rise the maps called Hill 1221, where Chinese fire from the high ground caught the trucks at close range with almost nowhere to take cover. Drivers were shot at the wheel, vehicles piled up behind stalled trucks with nowhere to go around them. What discipline had carried the column through the day began to come apart in the dark, unit by unit, truck by truck, as men realized there was no longer anyone left who could see the whole picture and hold it together. By the early hours of December 2, the column effectively stopped being a column. Trucks sat abandoned along the road with wounded men still inside some of them, engines dead, ammunition gone. Officers and sergeants who had held small pieces of the line all day made the same decision independently, within minutes of each other, because there was no longer a higher headquarters to ask. Get out on foot. Head for the reservoir ice and the marine lines beyond it. Leave nothing behind that could be helped, and leave everything that could not. What followed was not a retreat in any organized sense. It was several hundred men, in twos and threes and alone, walking out across the frozen surface of Chosin Reservoir in the dark, wind-scored ice under a night sky, with Chinese riflemen firing down from the shore whenever a shape moved against the snow. Some carried wounded friends on their backs. Some simply walked, numb past feeling their own feet, toward lights they hoped were Hagaruri and not another position waiting to kill them. There was no formation left to protect. At Hagaruri, word reached Lieutenant Colonel Olin Ball, 52 years old, a 30-year Marine running the division's motor transport, that men were out on the ice. He took a jeep and drove onto the reservoir himself, then went back out again and again through gunfire and a cold that historians would later put close to 24 degrees below zero. For roughly 12 hours, he crossed and recrossed the open ice, pulling survivors up out of the snow and the dark one and two at a time, until the count of men he had personally carried in reached 319. By the time the last of them stumbled into the marine perimeter, the task force that had held the reservoir's east side no longer existed as a fighting unit, only as a scattering of exhausted men being counted, one name at a time, against lists that would take weeks to reconcile. Somewhere among them was a soldier still carrying a sea ration tin he had never managed to eat, thawed and refrozen against his body a dozen times over 4 days. Somewhere in the snow behind them, buried by now, was a torn silver star ribbon nobody would ever go back to find. Of the roughly 3,200 men who had held the reservoir's east shore, about 50 reached the marine perimeter at Hagaruri, most on foot, some carried, some crawling the last 100 yards. Of those, only 385 were judged fit to carry a rifle again. They were folded into a provisional battalion under the 1st Marine Division and marched south with the rest of the breakout to the sea, men from a task force that no longer had a name painted on any truck, fighting alongside strangers who had never heard of them. Colonel McLean did not live to see any of it. Taken prisoner on the ice on November 29, he died in Chinese custody within days, his exact fate unconfirmed for years afterward. He was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. For decades, his family knew only that he was gone, not how, not where, a common enough ending for a war that produced more missing men than easy answers. Lieutenant Colonel Faith's body was never recovered from the roadblock near Hudong. For 62 years, he had no grave. A joint American and North Korean recovery team found remains in that region in 2004. DNA testing finally confirmed his identity on October 11, 2012. On April 17, 2013, Don Faith was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, 63 years after the breakout that killed him. His widow, Barbara, had accepted his Medal of Honor from General Omar Bradley back in 1951, at a Pentagon ceremony he never lived to attend. Lieutenant Colonel Olin Beale received the Distinguished Service Cross for the 12 hours he spent driving a jeep across open, gun-swept ice, pulling exhausted men up out of the snow until his count reached 319. He went home a Marine motor transport officer who had, almost as an afterthought, carried out one of the largest personal rescues of the entire Korean War. The identifications kept coming, long after anyone still expected them. Corporal Jules Hodderman in 2016, Sergeant James Sharp in 2017, Sergeant First Class Rufus Ketchum in 2018, Corporal Asa Vance in 2019, Sergeant First Class Nicholas Valentine as late as 2021. Each name meant a casket finally coming home, a family finally closing a file that had sat open since the winter of 1950, 70 years and more after the ice. The task force fought on the reservoir's blind east shore, out of sight of the reporters who traveled with the Marines, and it did not end as an organized withdrawal that could be written up as a triumph of discipline. It ended as a disintegration, men walking out alone across the ice, which made for a harder story to tell and an easier one to leave out. The unit did not even have the name history remembers it by. An Army historian coined Task Force Faith more than a decade later. Official recognition, a presidential unit citation, did not come until 1999, 49 years after the men who earned it were already dead or scattered or old. By most estimates, they had faced 6 to 8 times their own number and fought 2 Chinese divisions to a standstill that kept those divisions off the battlefield for months afterward. Nobody planned it that way, and almost nobody walked away from it whole. Had anyone told this story before today, the men of Task Force Faith might not still be a rumor at the edge of the Chosin story, the ones who held the far shore while the history books looked the other way. Had you ever heard of them before now? Barbara Faith raised their children without a husband and, for 62 years, without a grave to visit. When Don Faith's remains finally came home in 2013, she was gone too, but their family stood at Arlington National Cemetery on April 17 as he was buried with full honors. A Medal of Honor citation read aloud over ground he had waited more than 6 decades to reach. The Defense PBW-MIA accounting agency kept working the reservoir's frozen ground long after the war left the headlines, and men once listed simply as missing kept coming home, one folded flag at a time, to towns that had stopped expecting them. Ask most Americans about Chosin Reservoir, and they will describe Marines fighting south through 78 miles of Chinese roadblocks, and they would not be wrong. That story had photographers, war correspondents, and a Marine Corps that understood how to tell it. Task Force Faith had none of that. It fought on the reservoir's far shore, out of camera range, and it broke apart instead of marching out in formation. Armies write history around units that survive intact enough to file a report. This one barely survived at all, and for 50 years, almost nobody outside the families filed anything on its behalf. Today, a modest stretch of frozen shoreline near the Punggye-ri Inlet draws almost no visitors, but the men who walked off that ice are remembered elsewhere now. In Chosin, few reunions that grow smaller every year, in a Medal of Honor citation read at Arlington, in DPAA case files still marked active. Historians studying Tanks Corps' decisions at Chosin now weigh Task Force Faith alongside the Marine breakout, not beneath it, crediting the two Chinese divisions it fought to a standstill with buying time that likely saved Hagaru-ri itself. The recognition came late, it came anyway. Nobody in that column signed up to become a footnote, and nobody who studies it now would call what happened to them a victory in any way that felt like one at the time. But 6 to 8 times their number came across that reservoir meaning to erase them, and by every count that matters, they did not disappear. They held a line most people have never heard of, at temperatures most people cannot imagine, and 319 of them owe their lives to a 52-year-old Marine, who would not stop driving out onto the ice. Had you ever heard of Task Force Faith before today?